Mark Carney sits in his Ottawa office this morning, staring at the latest trade statistics that would make any economist's blood run cold. Canada's GDP growth has dropped to 0.8% in the third quarter of 2025, the lowest since the pandemic. Unemployment has climbed to 7.2%, while inflation hovers stubbornly at 4.1%. Just 48 hours ago, Donald Trump terminated all trade negotiations with Canada over a television advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs. The same advertisement that prompted Trump to slap an additional 10% tariff on Canadian goods, escalating what was already a devastating trade war. This isn't just another diplomatic spat between neighbors. This is the moment when Mark Carney, the former central banker who was supposed to bring technocratic stability to Canadian politics, discovered that expertise means nothing when your opponent holds all the economic cards. The path that brought us to this crisis reveals something profound about power, economics, and the limits of conventional wisdom in an age of economic nationalism. Carney's rise from Goldman Sachs trader to governor of the Bank of Canada to governor of the Bank of England seemed to follow a perfect trajectory. His credentials were impeccable. Harvard economics degree, 13 years at the world's most powerful investment bank, stewardship of two major central banks through financial crises. When he won Canada's Liberal Party leadership in March 2025, defeating Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, the global financial community celebrated. Here was a man who understood markets, who had navigated Brexit and the early pandemic response, who could surely handle Trump's mercurial trade policies. But credentials that work in boardrooms don't necessarily translate to the brutal arithmetic of trade wars. The banker's gamble. When Carney took office as Canada's 24th Prime Minister in April 2025, he inherited a relationship with the United States that was already fracturing. Trump had imposed 35% tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by the USMCA trade agreement in August 2024. Targeting sectors from aerospace to agriculture. Steel and aluminum faced 50% tariffs, decimating entire communities across Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. Carney's response revealed both his strengths and his fundamental miscalculation. He approached the crisis like a central banker managing monetary policy, believing that rational economic arguments would prevail over political theater. His October 7th meeting with Trump at the White House seemed promising, with both sides speaking of progress and mutual respect. Trade talks resumed, and markets briefly rallied on hopes of a comprehensive deal. But Carney had misread the nature of the conflict entirely. This wasn't a technical dispute about trade balances or regulatory harmonization. This was Trump using economic pressure to achieve broader political objectives, including his recurring suggestions that Canada should become the 51st American state. Where Carney saw market inefficiencies to be corrected, Trump saw leverage to be exploited. The difference between these worldviews would prove catastrophic for Canadian families and businesses caught in the crossfire. The spark that ignited the current crisis came from an unlikely source. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's decision to run an anti-tariff advertisement during the World Series. The 30-second spot featured Ronald Reagan from a 1988 weekly address, saying that tariffs cause trade wars and economic disaster. The advertisement spliced together 5 sentences from Reagan's 5-minute speech, removing the context that Reagan was defending tariffs on Japan as a sadly unavoidable exception to free trade principles. Ford's team thought they were being clever, using a Republican icon to criticize Republican policies. Instead, they handed Trump the perfect excuse to escalate. Trump's reaction was swift and punishing. On Thursday, October 23rd, he terminated all trade negotiations with Canada, calling the advertisement a serious misrepresentation and hostile act. When the ad ran again during Friday's World Series game between the Toronto Blue Jays and Los Angeles Dodgers, Trump imposed an additional 10% tariff on all Canadian goods while flying to Malaysia for the ASEAN summit. The economic impact was immediate. The Canadian dollar fell 2 cents against the U.S. dollar in weekend trading, energy stocks plummeted, and futures markets signaled significant disruption to cross-border supply chains. Ford quickly agreed to pull the advertisement, but the damage was done. Behind the political theater and market volatility lies a devastating human reality that neither Trump nor Carney adequately acknowledges. In Windsor, Ontario, automotive parts manufacturer Sarah Chen has laid off 40% of her workforce as tariffs make her products uncompetitive in American markets. Her remaining 60 employees face uncertain futures as customer orders continue declining. In Alberta, energy worker Michael Rodriguez saw his salary cut by 25% as oil and gas exports face increasing restrictions and tariffs. His mortgage payments haven't changed, but his ability to make them has. The ripple effects extend far beyond directly affected industries. Canadian retailers report that American suppliers are raising prices to offset tariff costs, pushing inflation higher for basic consumer goods. Healthcare systems in border communities struggle as medical device imports become more expensive. Universities face budget pressures as research partnerships with American institutions face new regulatory barriers. These aren't abstract economic statistics. They're families choosing between heating bills and groceries, students postponing education plans, and small businesses closing permanently. Every percentage point of tariff translates to real hardship for real people who had no voice in the political decisions that created this crisis. The Prime Minister's response to Trump's escalation reveals the fundamental weakness in his approach to this crisis. Carney continues speaking the language of international economics, emphasizing Canada's willingness to resume talks when the Americans are ready and stressing the mutual benefits of free trade. His background at the Bank of England and Bank of Canada taught him to communicate through carefully calibrated statements designed to influence market expectations. But Trump doesn't operate according to central banking principles or international trade law. He responds to political pressure, media narratives, and personal grievances. Carney's insistence on maintaining diplomatic decorum while Canadian communities suffer economic devastation suggests a leader out of touch with both the nature of his opponent and the urgency of his country's situation. His recent pivot toward Asian markets, including his attendance at the Malaysia-ASEAN summit alongside Trump, represents a long-term strategic shift that offers little immediate relief for affected workers and businesses. Meanwhile, Trump's tariffs continue extracting painful concessions from Canadian exporters while generating revenue for the American Treasury. The asymmetry in economic leverage becomes more apparent with each passing day. The limits of technocratic leadership. What makes this crisis particularly revealing is how it exposes the limitations of technocratic governance in an era of populist politics. Carney's entire career was built on the premise that expertise, data, and rational analysis could solve complex problems. As a central banker, he dealt with crises by adjusting interest rates, implementing quantitative easing programs, and communicating policy intentions to markets. These tools worked because financial markets operate according to relatively predictable principles and respond to credible commitments from respected institutions. But trade wars aren't monetary policy disputes. They're exercises in raw economic power where the stronger party can impose costs on the weaker party until political objectives are achieved. Trump's tariffs aren't designed to optimize economic efficiency or promote mutual prosperity. They're designed to extract concessions and demonstrate American dominance. Carney's continued faith in rational dialogue and technical solutions suggests a leader who hasn't fully grasped that he's playing by different rules than his opponent. This isn't a crisis that can be resolved through careful calibration of policy instruments or eloquent explanations of economic theory. As this crisis deepens, Canada faces increasingly stark choices that reveal the harsh realities of economic dependence. The country sends 75% of its exports to the United States, making diversification away from American markets a long-term project rather than a short-term solution. Carney's pivot toward Asia, while strategically sensible, will take years to generate meaningful trade volumes and cannot replace the integrated supply chains built over decades of North American cooperation. Retaliatory tariffs against American goods would hurt Canadian consumers and businesses while having minimal impact on the much larger American economy. The Prime Minister's options are essentially limited to capitulation or escalation, neither of which offers a clear path to victory. Capitulation means accepting Trump's trade terms and potentially broader political demands, validating the use of economic coercion and encouraging future pressure campaigns. Escalation means accepting higher short-term costs for Canadian workers and businesses, while hoping that American importers and consumers eventually pressure Trump to moderate his position. Both choices carry significant political risks for Carney's government and economic risks for Canadian families already struggling with inflation and unemployment. Canada's crisis illuminates a broader shift in global economics where technical expertise and institutional credibility matter less than raw power and political will. Mark Carney's troubles represent more than one leader's miscalculation or one country's economic vulnerability. They reveal the fundamental challenges facing any nation caught between economic integration and political sovereignty in an age of rising nationalism and great power competition. The former central banker who was supposed to bring stability and competence to Canadian governance instead finds himself managing a crisis that defies both technical solutions and diplomatic convention. The next phase of this conflict will likely determine not just the future of Canadian-American trade relations, but the broader question of whether smaller nations can maintain economic independence when larger neighbors are willing to weaponize commercial relationships. Trump's tariffs are generating approximately $175 billion in additional federal revenue while imposing disproportionate costs on Canada's much smaller economy. The mathematics of this relationship are brutally simple. America can afford this conflict longer than Canada can. Whether Mark Carney can find a path through this reality without compromising either Canada's economic interests or political sovereignty remains the defining challenge of his premiership. The stakes extend far beyond trade statistics to fundamental questions about national autonomy in an interconnected world where economics and politics have become inseparable. If you found this analysis valuable, please like and subscribe for more in-depth coverage of global economic and political developments. Share your thoughts in the comments about how you think this trade conflict will ultimately resolve and what it means for international relations more broadly. Analysis based on public data as of October 2025.